passengers on the Empress of the Seas are waving goodbye to Havana, earlier than planned. It's the last U.S. cruise ship to sail out of Cuba, after the Trump administration announced a sudden travel ban on the island on Tuesday. The order effectively makes U.S. cruises there illegal.
It gives us an uneasy feeling as travelers. For one, we don't feel that it should be where we cannot visit where we want to visit on our vacations. The president should not have the authority to dictate to us where we get to spend our vacation, our time, or our money.
Cuba had experienced a boom in American visitors in recent years. That rise happened after former President Barack Obama eased a half-century trade embargo and loosened travel restrictions to improve relations with the communist island. Americans became the second biggest group of tourists in Cuba after Canadians, and half those visitors arrived on cruise ships. In the first 4 months of this year alone, more than 140 people came to Cuba on cruise ships. That's a more than 300% rise over the same period last year. The new regulation affects nearly 800,000 bookings that were already made. It's a huge blow to Cubans who've built a livelihood around the industry.
We're going to struggle because tourism was a way to sustain ourselves, for those who are self-employed, for the state, for everyone.
Figures have never been made public, but it's estimated the government made millions of dollars a year in docking fees and payments for onshore excursions. Washington says it wants to end that flow of cash, as it accuses Havana of supporting Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. Economists, however, are optimistic other visitors can fill the gap U.S. tourists are leaving behind.
It will require new strategies to deal with this scenario. Cuba has done this repeatedly at other times, so now we'll have to apply new commercial strategies towards other markets.
We can't lose hope in life. If the Americans don't come, then the Chinese will, or the Russians, or the French, or even the Dutch. We will adapt to it.
Cubans have endured U.S. sanctions for 60 years, and changing course will be the only way for them and the cruise industry to brave these rough waters. Sibel Karkus, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, Jim Bialik joins us now from Washington, D.C. He's the Vice President at Engage Cuba, a coalition of private companies and organisations calling for an end to the travel and trade embargoes on Cuba. Welcome to Money Talks, Jim. As we heard in that story, these new travel restrictions ban cruise ships as well as group tours that originate from the US into Cuba. Tell us more about the impact that will have not only on Cuba but also on US businesses.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you for having me. But I will say that when we talk about Americans traveling to Cuba, there are restrictions beyond just travel that apply to Americans when they're there. And so when you look at the kind of businesses that they are interacting with, the way they're interacting with the Cuban people, there's something unique about the way Americans travel there, because it really is a one-on-one cultural exchange. There's a higher likelihood of patronizing individually owned businesses instead of those that are owned by the Cuban government. So the impact on Cubans living on the island is going to be significant with a shortage of Americans there, because Americans aren't going to the resort towns, not staying in the hotels where they're not engaging with self-employed and small business owners. So it will be a major hit to the Cuban private sector, fledgling private sector.
That's right. And what about the American private sector? Because presumably they have a large hand in getting tourists to Cuba. What impact will that have stateside?
There will be a significant impact on the industries that service travel. So especially when you look at where cruises are going, leaving from the United States to go to Cuba, there are many, many people that work to service the port, to service the cruise line, any kind of things that are sold on the ship. I mean, there are significant impacts to the American companies that service those cruise lines just to get them into the water. That said, we also expect to see changes in educational and cultural travel because those have been among the more common ways that Americans are traveling to Cuba.
Now, the Trump administration says that these rules are part of an effort to keep US dollars out of the hands of the Cuban government, which it accuses of backing US adversaries such as Nicaragua and Venezuela. Do you agree?
I would say that that seems to be a little out of sync with the way the stated policy towards Cuba and towards travel around the world has been established. Americans can travel anywhere in the world except for North Korea and Cuba. So if we're looking at other countries where we have new tariffs or existing sanctions or have been traditionally adversaries with the United States, we can still travel there. We can still spend money there. We can still send money there. Cuba has been put in a special category, and it is going to run counter to what U.S. policy towards the island has been, which is to increase the private sector, increase economic engagement with the goal of building a private sector that will eventually outsize the government-owned economy and create additional democratization through economic engagement. The point I would make is that the administration is very much in a re-election mode at this point, and they know they're not going to be reelected without Florida. This is an issue that puts them in a positive category when it comes to Cuban American voters, and also distracts from issues like affordable health care, which we know that will lead to more Democratic turnout in the state come the 2020 elections. So I think this is a calculated move, more focused on the political and less on the good policy that would actually achieve the goal that we share with the government, which is to see a free, open economic relationship with Cuba.
Interesting. Now, as we know, former President Barack Obama eased travel restrictions in 2016. Donald Trump is now looking to reverse those. What impact did Barack Obama's policy have on Cuba?
It was significant. Not the least of which was spurring the massive expansion of the private sector. Before the Obama opening, you had single-digit growth in the private sector. Most of the economy was controlled by the state. And now we've seen estimates that the private sector could be more than a third of the total economy. So if you look at what that economic transformation has looked like over that short amount of time, clearly having more Americans visiting Cuba, engaging with the private sector there, has had a very clear impact. And the other thing I would add is that the Cuban government has made significant changes to its own constitution in that time as well, and many of those changes have gone to stimulate small and medium-sized enterprises and private business owners. So we're even seeing structural changes in Cuba beyond just the economic growth.
Okay, Jim Bialik, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your thoughts.